Today is June 30th, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues to erode Ukraine's fighting capacity. This is something that myself, many other analysts have been pointing out for months, if not years. This is something that the Russian Ministry of Defense has claimed, but now it is something the collective Western media is admitting. And I will get into all of that in just a moment. First, let's go over the situation on the ground. Let's look at liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map. So if even they are admitting that Russian forces are on the move all along the line of contact, not just in Kharkov, not just in the Donbas region, but along the entire line of contact, if that's what they are admitting, the situation is likely much, much worse. So let's just take a look at the line of contact. We see heavy fighting here around Kherson. This is the Krynki bridgehead that Ukraine has tried to establish. I will get into that in just a moment. There was a recent BBC article about that. We can see fighting here in this tiny salient that Ukraine created during its failed 2023 offensive. Russian forces continue to minimize that. And we see fighting all along the line of contact in the Donbas region, outside of Donetsk and at Avdiivka. Russian forces continue to move. And again, this is a pro-Ukrainian map, and these red rifle icons beyond territory that is admittedly held and consolidated by Russia. You can see Russian forces are pushing out beyond that. That is where the fighting is. And this is what has been going on since Russian forces took Avdiivka. They have been steadily moving westward. We also see it here and outside of Bakhmut. We see Russian forces pushing around the edges of this salient surrounding Seversk. And we see the fighting continuing all the way up until the northeast Kharkov region. Despite Ukrainian forces claiming they've made all of these gains, pushing Russian forces back, this on the pro-Ukrainian map has not changed at all for days, if not weeks. Now let's talk about Kharkov and how Ukraine has shifted soldiers from all along the line of contact to go to Kharkov and stop Russian forces. And even though this article from the BBC, there was no preparation. One Marine story of defending Kharkiv, also known as Kharkov. This was from June 29th, 2024. And they're talking about how Ukrainian soldiers fighting in these desperate, some might even say pointless or futile battles along the line of contact elsewhere. This Ukrainian Marine was taken from Krynki, near Kherson, this foothold Ukraine is stubbornly holding on to on the east bank of the Dnieper River, how they were rushed to Kharkov because they don't have enough troops. They are taking troops from other places they claim are critical along the line of contact and transferring them to Kharkov. When you're doing this, this is because you are suffering from a critical manpower shortage. This is desperation. The article talks about how the fighting in Krynki was hell, that they're citing a Ukrainian Marine that they interviewed. It said, "We managed to maintain the bridgehead, but no equipment has crossed it, and we haven't once broken through Russian defenses." And this has been going on for months and months and months. That is where they are. Then the BBC talks about what some of the goals are of maintaining this bridgehead, or at least according to Kiev. It's to draw invading troops from elsewhere, to limit Russian artillery strikes on Kherson city across the river, and to eventually cross it in large enough numbers to liberate territory. None of this connects to reality in any way. Russia has many troops, a lot of equipment, a lot of ammunition. They're capable of keeping this bridgehead in check while also fighting Ukraine along the entire line of contact. You saw the live map, a pro-Ukrainian live map. Russia is not forced to pick where it focuses along the line of contact. They are applying pressure, significant pressure, all along the line of contact, which is why Ukraine is suffering this manpower crisis in the first place. Then it said, and the name of the Ukrainian Marine goes by the name Oleksiy. He says promised U.S. military aid was gradually starting to arrive, but not all of it was making it to the front line where he was based. Despite partially forcing the Ukrainians back, Ukrainian troops still endure constant Russian fire. Any movement was immediately covered by artillery or drones, he explains. The Russians didn't seem concerned by our presence there either. We had become a suitcase without a handle. The troops there can't leave, and everyone understands that's useless. And why isn't US and European military aid making it to everywhere along the line of contact? Because as I have explained, going over these arms transfers to Ukraine in detail, it is simply too little, too late. There's not enough arms and ammunition to properly supply the entire Ukrainian military. It is just enough to keep this process of bleeding Ukraine out, to stretch it out for as long as possible. That is all Western aid is doing for Ukraine, and it is working in that sense. This article is explaining how futile these Ukrainian offensives are, how pointless they are, and this is following the 2023 offensive, this massive offensive Ukraine planned for months and months, essentially built an entire army using NATO equipment, NATO training. They threw it at Russian defenses, and it was like hitting a wall of steel. And Russia wiped out brigades worth of manpower and equipment. They themselves maintained their defenses, and relative to Ukrainian losses, suffered very, very few losses in terms of manpower and equipment. Then the BBC cites another Ukrainian soldier. He goes by the call sign Boston. It says, it's hoped a new mobilization law, which came into force last month, will help give troops like those fighting on the eastern bank a rest. And this is the narrative that the Western media, Western governments have been pushing, that this mobilization is going to be a game changer. Finally, entirely new brigades are going to be stood up over the next 6 months, and they're going to be able to go back on the offensive against Russia. And as I have pointed out many times before, you cannot build brigades from scratch. It could take between 2 and 3 years to do it properly. There's no way for Ukraine to do it at all, let alone in such a short period of time. So I have warned that this mobilization is an act of desperation. It's not going to change anything on the battlefield. And that is what the Ukrainians interviewed by the BBC say. It said, it won't change anything, says Boston, a flamethrower unit commander who is still fighting on the eastern bank. Boston is his military code name. He sends us videos of him on patrol in Krinky by the riverside. At one point, he shoots a Russian anti-personnel mine hidden beneath the sand. People should join the army from 20, he says, but there is a problem. A lot of men went abroad to escape the draft. No one wants to come back. No one wants to fight, and no one wants to die, which I think is a very reasonable position to hold if you're a Ukrainian fighting a war for U.S. NATO hegemony entirely at your own expense. So this isn't Russian media. This isn't citing Russian sources. This is British state media, the BBC, interviewing Ukrainians on the ground along the line of contact. The article, when you read through the entire article, doesn't even talk about the fighting in Kharkov. It just talks about how desperate and futile the fighting in Krinky was before they were transferred to Kharkov. It says President Zelensky admits his priority is simply to hold the front line. If his troops manage that before the arrival of autumn and more difficult fighting conditions, it would be viewed as a success. As he claims, there are still plans for a counteroffensive in the future. They're going to try to do it again. If Oleksiy survives defending the Kharkov region, he should find himself back at Ukraine's hellish river crossing in the south. So somehow they imagine that this Ukrainian Marine is going to somehow, along with the rest of the Ukrainian armed forces, they're going to secure, push back the Russians in Kharkov, and then he's going to go back to Krinky, where he's going to be part of this admittedly futile, pointless offensive that has gone nowhere, admittedly has gone nowhere. So they're talking about mobilization. These Ukrainians on the ground say it's not going to make any difference. And they were complaining that nobody wants to join the military, that this mobilization is going to fall short. And this is not them imagining it. This is something that is being admitted all across the Western media now. I am not made for war. The men fleeing Ukraine to evade conscription. As a new recruitment drive looms, there's no recruitment drive. They are pressing people against their will into service. People with no military experience, no military training, they're pressing them into service and sending them to the front with sometimes as little as 2 months of training, which is not nearly enough. I'll get into that in just a moment. Some are turning to online handlers and forgers to escape the horror of war. So they're willing to do anything to get out of going to the front line and dying in this pointless proxy war. Since the start of the war, thousands of Ukrainian men have illegally crossed the Ukrainian border to dodge conscription, despite a nationwide ban prohibiting men between the ages of 18 and 60 from leaving. Attempts to flee the country are expected to increase after Ukraine's recent adoption of a new sweeping mobilization measure, which allowed the military to call up more soldiers and impose stricter penalties for draft invasion. So there's no sense of recruitment where you're asking people to join up. They're forcing people to join the military. Even before the latest mobilization drive, more than 20,000 men are believed to have fled the country to avoid service, some of them swimming and drowning in attempts to cross Ukraine's mountainous western border into Romania. We remember when analysts, Russian media were talking about press gangs clubbing Ukrainians over the head, throwing them into vans and sending them to the front line. That was just Russian propaganda. Now they are openly admitting that this has been going on even before the new mobilization law was put into effect. It also admits more than 2 years into Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion, Ukraine's armed forces are desperately short of soldiers. How could that possibly be if the Western media has told us for 2 years plus now that it's Russia suffering catastrophic losses and Ukraine has the advantage? They're outfighting the Russians. They're using superior Western military equipment, precision weapons to take a toll out on the Russians. The Russians have more artillery rounds, sometimes up to 10 times more, but it's ineffective, it's inaccurate, it's all old Soviet junk operated by poorly trained, poorly led soldiers. So somehow Ukraine has been outfighting Russia. Now they're admitting that that is not true. They're desperately short of soldiers. Russia is not desperately short of soldiers. And it doesn't say anywhere in this article that Russia is short of soldiers. It admits more than 2 years into Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion, Ukraine's armed forces are desperately short of soldiers, which is what people have been saying all along, that the Western media, the Ukrainian government has been denying. Now they're openly admitting this. And nowhere in the article does it talk about Russian losses or a Russian shortage of soldiers. We're not really seeing those type of articles anymore because it's abundantly clear that it isn't true. Then let's go back to the article, the Guardian article. It's very important to look at these photos very carefully. So they're showing all of these images about mobilizing manpower, and they have a recruiting poster. It says schoolboys pass a poster calling on people to sign up for the army in Kiev last September. But if you look closely at this poster, you see in the background, there you can see these 3 diagonal lines behind him. This is a modern variation of Nazi Germany's Wolf's Angle, a symbol used by Nazi Germany military formations during World War II. Azov, admittedly founded by a neo-Nazi Andrei Belitsky, from the very beginning, they used Nazi symbols on their flags and on their uniforms. And to this day, despite being removed by the U.S. From a list of banned organizations unable to receive U.S. weapons, ammunition training, they have removed them from the banned list, but they're still using Nazi symbols openly in their recruiting posters even. So that is what's going on in Ukraine. This is how desperate the manpower situation is. The United States cannot pretend to be morally outraged at Nazis if not, the Nazis are one of the last fanatical military formations in Ukraine still fighting this proxy war. They need to use them. They cannot afford to even pretend not to support them. The Guardian article concludes, while overall support for the country's troops remain high and polls show that there is still a considerable number of men willing to be mobilized,
Is that true? Ukraine's conscription drive risks dividing Ukrainian society already plagued by war fatigue. If there was a considerable number of men willing to be mobilized, why would your mobilization methods need to be so radically expanded? That doesn't really add up. Many Ukrainian soldiers at the front, or those who have returned after being injured, criticize draft dodging, arguing that the practice weakens their country's war effort as Russian forces make advances across multiple fronts. So they're admitting Russia is still advancing, even though we've heard for the last couple of weeks that Ukraine has somehow stabilized the front, and this has all been a big stalemate all along anyway. So again, Western media reports citing Ukrainian soldiers, revealing now in this late hour things that myself, other analysts have been saying for months, if not years. There's even more evidence, though, of just how critical the manpower shortage is, how catastrophic Ukraine's losses have been. We have this article, also from the BBC. Zelensky sacks top general accused of incompetence. And what type of incompetence? Losing cities, regions, and thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. This is what he's being blamed for. And this contradicts this illusion that the Ukrainian government itself, its Western backers, have tried to create regarding the very small losses Ukraine is suffering versus the heavy losses they're inflicting on Russia. It says Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has dismissed a top general after public criticism about excessive casualties and accusations of incompetence. The chief of staff of the Azov brigade, so here's Azov, modern day Nazis, Ukrainian Nazis, here they are again. They seem to be everywhere, almost as if they're a central component of Ukraine's military and government. They filed a complaint to the State Bureau of Investigation, alleging that this general had more Ukrainian soldiers killed than any Russian general. Does that sound like an army that is winning, or an army that is out fighting Russia? Doesn't sound like it to me. They're saying he must be investigated for loss of regions, dozens of cities, and loss of thousands of soldiers. The ultimate irony here is Azov Nazi military formations in Ukraine have also lost entire cities. They were the principal defenders of Mariupol. They lost Mariupol to Russian forces who cleared them out, captured them in large numbers, expelled them from Mariupol and from elsewhere all along the line of contact. Azov goes to all of these cities when they're about to fall to try to change the tide, and they ultimately fail over and over again. Bakhmut is another example. So they themselves are guilty of fighting in futile battles where they are losing thousands of soldiers and where they ultimately lose cities and regions to advancing Russian forces. So what is this actually? This is scapegoating and blame and scapegoating. This is something a military resorts to, a government, a society resorts to when they're in the process of losing a war. It is not something you do when everything is going your way. And because they do not have large numbers of men in Ukraine willing to join the military, willing to be mobilized, I guess by that they mean men who simply don't have the ability to flee mobilization. I think that's more what they mean. They are trying to recruit prisoners. So this is from Kiev Independent, is a pro-Ukrainian source. Inside Ukraine's prison recruitment efforts to bolster frontline troops. A debatable path to redemption is part of Ukraine's latest strategy to replenish its forces, recruiting from prisons. This was June 12th, 2024. Do you remember when Russia had this Wagner organization recruiting from prisons and how this was said to have been a desperate move by a losing Russia? Well, now here is a Ukrainian source admitting that this is now Ukrainian policy, trying to recruit from prisons because there is a deficit in manpower. Now, the difference between what Ukraine is doing right now and what Russia did then, Russia with Wagner was buying time for an actual mobilization, and not a mobilization of untrained conscripts, a mobilization of former military who are still part of the Russian reserve system being called up, retrained, and then sent into the area of operation. That is the huge difference between what Russia was doing with Wagner and what the Ukrainian military is doing now
trying to find prisoners willing to fight. The article says, as Ukraine's new mobilization law comes into effect, the country is also turning to prisons to replenish its troops. The government has said it's looking to recruit 20,000 convicts, with an initial campaign seeing around 5,000 inmates trading their cells for trenches. But in reality, Ukraine is probably losing close to 20,000 men a month, whether it's dead or injured. So you're trying to find just 20,000 prisoners in total. You only have 5,000. How long does it take to train them and get them to the battlefield? Are these men going to make it to the battlefield in sufficient numbers? When you reach 20,000, are you still going to have any soldiers left from the first 5,000 you were able to mobilize? And the answer is no. And this is what they say about training. The 5th Assault Brigade aims to headhunt at least 600 motivated and strong inmates for a separate battalion where only prisoners serve. After 2 months of boot camp, they will be deployed to the Eastern Front in Donetsk Oblast, where the brigade fights the endless battle of Donbass. So 2 months is not nearly enough to train a soldier for combat. As a U.S. Marine, you will receive 3 months of basic training. And if you are not infantry, you will still receive an additional 1 month of combat training for a total of 4 months. If you are an infantryman, you will receive another 3 months of intense infantry training for a total of 6 months. Before you go to your unit is going to be comprised of other entry-level infantrymen, but also experienced Marines with years of service, with higher ranks in leadership positions, able to take you and continue your training and your development as an infantryman. This is not going to happen with these prison units that they're throwing together in just 2 months. This is the closest thing you can do to just throwing them into the front line right out of prison, just to throw bodies at the problem. That is what Ukraine is doing. This is what they had accused Russia of doing. This is what they are doing as a matter of policy now, openly, publicly, when they say 2 months of training. The article even talks about Wagner, who recruited soldiers from prison. It says Moscow continues inmate recruitment regardless of crimes committed, offering pardons if they make it through 6 months of endless assaults. So they're trying to make it out as if Russia is also doing this. But if you're claiming that Russia is doing this because they're desperate, you're admitting, because you're now doing it, that you're also desperate. But is Russia desperate? As I pointed out, it was under completely different circumstances. Those soldiers were demobilized after 6 months. Are these prisoners coming out of Ukrainian prisons? Are they going to be demobilized? Nobody else in the Ukrainian military is being demobilized. Why would they demobilize these prisoners? So you could just see how, even just carefully reading this article, how desperate this whole policy is. Now, because there is such a shortage of Ukrainian manpower, even just bodies to throw at the problem, let alone properly trained Ukrainian soldiers to go fight at the front, saying nothing of well-trained, competent Ukrainians with technical skills needed to maintain and repair all of the weapons that they are receiving now from across NATO. So this is from CNN, June 25th, Biden administration moves toward allowing American contractors to deploy to Ukraine. Now, these contractors have already been in Ukraine all along. They're just formalizing this, obviously. Says the Biden administration is moving toward lifting a de facto ban on American military contractors deploying to Ukraine. 4 U.S. officials familiar with the matter told CNN to help the country's military maintain and repair U.S.-provided weapon systems. Because what they were doing before this was sending it all the way to Poland to be repaired and then all the way back to the front line. It is a 1,000-kilometer trip each way. And so they think by sending these contractors into Ukraine closer to the line of contact, this turnaround can be sped up. But the problem with all of this is not enough military equipment is being sent in the first place. Even if you speed up the turnaround, you're not going to solve the problem that there just simply isn't enough of this equipment or the ammunition necessary to change things strategically
in this conflict. It says, once approved, the change would likely be enacted this year, officials said, and would allow the Pentagon to provide contracts to American companies for work inside Ukraine for the first time since Russia invaded in 2022. Officials said they hope it will speed up the maintenance and repairs of weapon systems being used by the Ukrainian military. Weapon systems that we can see with our own eyes are ineffective in this fight, are not making the difference that the Western media claimed that they would before they were actually sent to the battlefield. It also says, over the last 2 years, Biden has insisted that all Americans, and particularly U.S. troops, stay away from the Ukrainian front lines, but they haven't been, and we know that. The White House has also determined to limit both the danger to Americans and the perception, particularly by Russia, that the U.S. military is engaged in combat there. But this is a major escalation because you are openly, deliberately placing U.S. contractors into Ukraine to participate in this war, however directly or indirectly you claim. The U.S. provided military equipment that has sustained significant damage in combat has been transported out of the country to Poland, Romania, or other NATO countries for repairs, a process which takes time. U.S. troops are also available to help the Ukrainians with more routine maintenance and logistics, but only from afar via video chat or secure phone, an arrangement that has come with inherent limitations since U.S. troops and contractors are not able to work directly on the system. So you see the slippery slope being created here. They're talking about letting contractors work inside Ukraine. They're admitting that contractors and U.S. soldiers are already working with Ukrainians via telecommunications. So eventually, will U.S. troops be in Ukraine? This is all part of the process the U.S. goes through when losing a proxy war. This is exactly what they were doing with their proxy war against Syria. They wanted to fight and overthrow the Syrian government with its proxies. When their proxies were being defeated, their involvement, training, and arming them became greater and greater until U.S. troops were literally on the ground occupying part of Syrian territory. So we see this same process repeating itself now in Ukraine as the U.S. loses its proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. Now, one of the reasons they've been maintaining weapon systems outside of Ukraine is because of Russia's ability to track down these maintenance facilities, strike them, destroy the equipment being repaired, and also kill the very valuable technicians maintaining it. And that is what is going to happen as you expand maintenance inside of Ukraine. You're going to suffer greater and greater losses in terms of equipment while it's being repaired, and the loss of personnel repairing it, maintaining and repairing it. And of course, this plan to send F-16 warplanes to Ukraine is going to obviously require U.S. contractors, European contractors to come in and maintain these F-16s. There are no Ukrainians capable of doing this. You cannot train them in this short of a time. You need people with years of experience working on the F-16 to properly maintain and repair them. And so at a minimum, you're going to have U.S. NATO personnel on the ground as part of this, of maintaining these F-16s, if they aren't also flying them, because Ukraine will not be able to effectively fly them in almost all of the roles we keep hearing Ukraine imagining they will use these F-16s for. Is it worth it to escalate in this manner, to speed up the turnaround of repairing equipment and getting it back into action? I don't think that it is worth it. I think overall it's going to speed up the destruction of this equipment, because instead of dividing the time that equipment spends in Ukraine, where Russia is capable of striking and destroying it, and being outside of Ukraine where Russia will not strike it, you're at least preventing it from being destroyed as quickly as if it was always in Ukraine and Russia had all the more opportunities to strike at it. So this, I think, is just going to result in an acceleration of lost equipment and lost technicians operating on it, which the U.S. does not have an infinite supply of. And speaking of all of this equipment, we have this from Associated Press. U.S. is expected to send Ukraine $150 million more in munitions to fight off Russia's attacks. And they're talking about, this was June 25th, so they're talking about Tuesday, so I guess it's this coming week, beginning of July. It says The upcoming shipment is expected to include munitions for the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS. That system is capable of firing the longer-range missiles from the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, which Russia has said would prompt retaliation and risk escalating the conflict, which is already happening. I have an entire other video coming out on the Ukrainian ATACMS strike on Crimea, where one of the missiles released cluster munitions over a populated beach, killing civilians. I'm going to get into that in depth, the implications of that, and the comments coming from Kiev itself regarding that. I'll get into that in a later video. It also says, one of the U.S. officials said they could not verify whether this aid package included ATACMS munitions, but said the aid did not include cluster munitions. Generally, these ATACMS have cluster warheads instead of the unitary warhead. And so maybe that means they're going to give another variety of ATACMS, the one that Ukraine would need to attempt to destroy the Crimean Bridge, for example. The package also includes anti-armor weapons, small arms, and grenades, and the highly sought-after 155mm and 105mm artillery rounds, among other support. And I've gone over these packages over and over again. The last package was almost identical to what they're describing here. And the reason they have them so frequently is because the US no longer has any ammunition or weapon systems in their stockpiles to spare for Ukraine. Everything that they're giving them now is coming out of monthly production, which, as I pointed out many times before, is not a lot. They do not make a lot of artillery shells, guided rockets for HIMARS, all of this other equipment that Ukraine needs. They do not make large enough quantities to satisfy just Ukraine alone. You have to remember, monthly production has to go to US stockpiles, training, stockpiles, operations around the globe, as well as to other customers around the globe. It cannot all just be directed straight to Ukraine. So that is why we see these small, frequent packages, because they're drawing what they can from monthly production and sending it, which is not enough and will never be enough. There has also been talk about additional Patriot missile systems being sent. And I saw this article from Financial Times. US in talks to send Israel's Patriot systems to Ukraine. Transfer up to 8 batteries would mark shift in Israel's relations with Moscow. And that makes it sound like Israel is going to send 8 batteries to Ukraine. But as the article explains, they're just talking about what from these 8 batteries they can spare to send Ukraine. They're not talking about sending all 8 batteries. But even if they did, I'm going to explain why that doesn't even matter. The article says the US, Israel, and Ukraine are in talks to supply Kiev with up to 8 Patriot air defense systems, dramatically improving its ability to counter Russian airstrikes. No, it doesn't. I'll explain why. While not finalized, the agreement would likely involve the highly prized Patriot systems being sent first from Israel to the US before being delivered to Ukraine. And this is what we keep hearing about South Korea. Russian President Vladimir Putin went to North Korea, signed these agreements between the two countries regarding closer cooperation, prompting South Korea to send arms directly to Ukraine. But they were already sending arms to Ukraine just via the United States, an intermediary. It absolutely changes nothing except the route the weapons and ammunition travel to get to Ukraine. So Israel is doing this as a formality to avoid directly supplying weapons to Ukraine. But it also says Israel said in April that it would begin retiring its 8 Patriot batteries, which date back more than 30 years, and replacing them with more advanced systems. But the batteries, which have been used in Israel's current war with Hamas, have not yet been discontinued due to concerns that tensions with the Iran-backed Hezbollah militant group could erupt into a full-blown war. If realized, such a transfer would represent a step change in Ukraine's defensive capabilities. The country currently has at least 4 Patriot systems supplied by both the US and Germany. They have 4. They could potentially get 8. Some of these systems already sent to Ukraine have been destroyed. And so it is not 4 entire Patriot systems.
And here's the problem. It's really not about launchers and systems, although Ukraine does need a steady supply of them because they are losing them on the battlefield. It is about the missiles the Patriot system fires, of which the United States only produces 550 annually. If Russia is launching over 4,000 missiles at targets across Ukraine every single year, and the United States is only producing 550 in total interceptors, 2 interceptors each must be fired at any particular incoming target to raise the probability of a successful intercept. You can see how it just does not add up in Ukraine's favor. Even if the entire planet sent all Patriot missile systems and missiles to Ukraine, it still would not be enough to change what is happening strategically. In the same article, they talk about how the power grid has been basically destroyed by these Russian missile strikes and drone strikes. So has the Patriot missile system been serving Ukraine well? I would say it hasn't been. What might giving Ukraine additional launchers, despite not having enough missiles to intercept all these incoming missiles and drones, what might that actually help Ukraine do? One possibility is that they will have additional launchers that they can spare, that they could afford to lose, and they can put them closer and closer to the line of contact to try to deal with these glide bombs. The problem is Ukraine will run out of Patriot missile systems long before Russia runs out of Su-34 fighter bombers. They make additional fighter bombers every single year. They will have the ability to continue launching glide bomb sorties all along the line of contact, even if Ukraine does do this. The last time they tried to do this, they seriously inflated the number of Su-34s that they downed. They had at the time claimed that they had cleared the skies over the Donbas region, but now Russia is dropping more glide bombs along the line of contact than ever. And so this is more public relations than anything else. It is to make Ukrainians and the rest of the world still supporting Ukraine in this proxy war, to make them think that there is a possibility the tide might turn. And that is to keep everyone supporting Ukraine and to keep Ukraine fighting despite the actual futility of doing so. And since we are talking about glide bombs, let's talk about the evolution of the collective Western media's coverage of these FAB-3000 glide bombs. This is a 3.3 ton glide bomb. And this is what Forbes was talking about back in March 25th, 2024. Don't fear Russia's 3.3 ton glide bomb. It's massive overkill when a 1.1 ton glide bomb will kill you just fine. Besides, it's not clear a Russian Air Force fighter bomber could fit a 3.3 ton ammunition. So just reading this from back in March of this year, you can see that this was seen in a Russian arms factory, and this was the Western media trying to downplay the implications of this, as if this was just for show. There's no way for Russia to even drop a bomb like this on targets in Ukraine, but now we know that it is now becoming almost routine. It said at the time when Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu inspected weapon factories in Nizhny Novgorod in Western Russia recently, one new munition stood out, a massive 3,000 kilogram bomb that was much bigger than the workers tinkering with it. Fitted with wings and satellite guidance, a FAB-3000 would make a powerful standoff munition, a retired Russian colonel and military analyst told state media, which is now confirmed to be true. They are very powerful bombs because they cause enormous destruction, they said. But a glide bomb, the FAB-3000, also would be unwieldy and likely lacking in range. This is Forbes making this claim, now proven to be untrue. Don't worry about the 3.3 ton FAB-3000. Instead, worry about the Russian glide bombs that aren't impractical for everyday use, the FAB-500, 1000, and 1500. And then it gives a short history of these glide bombs and Ukrainian attempts to stop them. Because we remember when the first glide bombs were dropped, we were told that they're crude, they're unguided, they're not going to make any difference. Besides, Ukraine will shoot them all down with their Patriot missile systems. And none of that happened. The opposite happened. They dropped more of them, they were guided, and they have turned the tide in fighting in places like Avdiivka. Ukraine's best air defenses, its American-made Patriots, range as far as 90 miles and can, in principle, hit glide bombers before they release their munitions, but only if the Patriot crew hit the road and deploy close to the front line. That apparently is what happened in February when Ukrainian air defenses shot down 13 Russian Sukhois in 13 days. That never happened. I think they may have shot down perhaps 2 or 3 at most. There was zero evidence of all of these additional claims. They were just reporting it every single day, and people just took these claims at face value, including Forbes, apparently. But the redeployment ended in disaster around March 9 when a Russian drone spotted a Patriot convoy 20 miles from the eastern front line and cued an Iskander ballistic missile that blew up at least 2 Patriot launchers. The Ukrainians pulled back their surviving air defenses, and the Russians resumed their relentless glide bombing. At the same time, a new wing kit has extended the range of the standard Russian glide bomb from 25 miles to 40 miles, doubling it, essentially, making it even harder for the Ukrainians to target the bombers. And so what this tells you is there is a process of not only mass production of these glide bombs, but a process of continuously improving them, both in terms of their accuracy and their range. So whatever shortcomings the FAB-3000 might seem to have now, I think it is safe to assume that if they are deemed useful, they will continue to be developed alongside all of these other glide bombs Russia has been effectively using and constantly improving. So that was back in March. Here's a much more recent article from June 22nd, 2024. Russia's 3.3-ton glide bombs scatter shrapnel farther than half a mile. But the bombs are scarier than they are effective. 3,300 pounds bombs is a better loadout than one 6,600 pound bomb. But that's according to David Axe, who back in March said Russia probably didn't have warplanes that could even drop a bomb this heavy. He was completely wrong. So what are the chances that this is the one thing David Axe is going to get right this year? Probably not high. The Russian Air Force has dropped its 3.3-ton glide bomb for the first time in combat. Back-to-back strikes demonstrated just how powerful and inefficient the huge new bomb is. I mean, I wonder if David Axe was on the ground in the building that this bomb supposedly missed. I wonder if he would have the same opinion. I wonder if he'd even be able to articulate his newly formed opinion if he was in that building when that bomb dropped. In both strikes, the huge bombs missed their targets by a short distance, but it hardly mattered. So this is according to Fighter Bomber, a popular Russian Telegram channel. A FAB-3000 causes blast damage to a distance of more than 200 yards and propels lethal fragments more than 1,200 yards. Missing a target by 30 feet or so is an excellent result for a Su-34 armed with a FAB-3000. As I pointed out in a previous update where I showed the video of this FAB-3000 bomb hitting next to a building, you could see smoke billowing out of the opposite side of the building, because it really doesn't matter if it hits it or not. It's going to send shock waves and deadly shrapnel in all directions through the building, killing people inside the building, possibly even people behind the building. That is how powerful it is, and smaller bombs would not achieve these results. So David Axe is just plain wrong. Then it says the Russian Air Force reportedly didn't build very many FAB-3000s. At the current strike rate, they could be gone soon. How many times have we heard the Western media claim Russia's about to run out of some weapon that it is using? We've heard this since the special military operation began. It's simply not true. If they want more bombs, they have the capability to build more of them. And if they find this weapon effective or worthwhile, they will build many more of these. They're not going to run out of them. That is wishful thinking on David Axe's part. And the Air Force will return to lobbing the more efficient 3,300 pound glide bombs. But even those bombs might lose their relevance soon. Desperate to blunt the impact of as many as 100 Russian glide bombs a month, Ukrainian forces have begun deploying more and better radio jammers that can block the signals between the bombs and the satellites that steer them, which is something that Russia has already done regarding the many GPS-guided precision weapons the U.S. has transferred to Ukraine. We remember all the Western articles that had previously promoted these weapons as game changers, only to write an article a month or two after they were deployed about how Russia is jamming them, they're missing their targets. But here's the problem with all of this idea that somehow Ukraine is going to be able to jam these glide bombs. Russia has demonstrated the ability to adapt very quickly and then mass produce the weapon systems based on this adaptation. If it turns out that these satellite-guided glide bombs are being jammed and missing their targets, Russia has laser-guided munitions. Maybe they'll use laser-guided glide bombs instead. They have an overabundance of drones that could mark targets, and the laser-guided bombs will then hit those targets. As you can see, when these FAB-3000 bombs are dropped, there is a Russian drone overhead watching the events unfold. There are also inertial guidance systems that allow a aircraft or a munition to figure out where it is in space by measuring different metrics around it: altitude, gravitational pull, acceleration. They can compute all of this together to get a rough idea of where they are in space and time, and they can guide themselves to the target. And of course, Russia has AI-guided kamikaze drones. How hard would it be to create a AI-guided glide bomb? For Russia, I don't think it would be impossible for them to do so, if this even becomes a real problem. So we see how Forbes's coverage of these powerful glide bombs, FAB-3000s, has changed from being skeptical they could even be deployed to trying to downplay the effectiveness of back-to-back FAB-3000 strikes. And here I would say is a much more realistic article published June 20th, 2024. Is this our first look at Russia's new monster glide bomb striking Ukraine? And you can just see how the initial explosion, saying nothing of the shockwave that extends far beyond the field of view of this image, you could see how destructive this single glide bomb has been. And so what does this article say? It says, just what aircraft would launch such a large weapon remains unclear, but something so destructive with standoff range is a real concern. So that is the takeaway. When we see these FAB-3000 bombs strike, that is the takeaway. It is a real concern. We already see how effective all of these other glide bombs used by Russian forces have been. Making them much larger and more destructive is obviously cause for concern. Now, one last topic I want to cover is the myth of Ukraine's newly authorized ability to strike into Russian territory, how this is somehow changing the strategic lay of this conflict. This is from Business Insider. Ukraine destroyed columns of waiting Russian troops as soon as it was allowed to strike across the border, commander says. Commander says, which means, and this is the most important sentence in the entire article, his claims have not been independently verified. That is the most important takeaway. Ukraine says a lot of things. The number of things they say that are actually truthful is very limited. And I think that would probably apply to this claim as well. The idea that HIMARS is somehow making a huge difference now that they're allowed to attack across the border is absolutely absurd. This is what it says. In the past, analysts described Ukraine as being forced to fight with one hand behind its back, with Russia using its own territory to resupply its forces and launch drone, missile, and aircraft attacks. Experts say this new reality has had a big impact there, particularly given the Russian border is so close to the fighting. Russia was able to resupply its forces with troops, ammunition, and equipment, and Ukraine could do little to interfere. Two Ukrainian officers told the Washington Post that some Russian attacks have been reduced, but they added that air bases where it is launching attacks from were out of range of what the US permission allowed Ukraine to hit. But here's reality. During Ukraine's 2023 offensive, Russia was supporting its defenses from the Crimean Peninsula. Warplanes, helicopters, missiles were being launched from sites not just in Crimea, but all along territory Kiev claims is Ukrainian. And they were unable to strike at and disrupt these airfields, these launch sites, the supply lines. They were unable to do that even within territory Ukraine claims is their territory. How does now firing into the much, much larger interior of Russia, how is this going to be a game changer? There are air bases
and factories and industrial sites across Russia, well out of range of any weapon system the West has supplied to Ukraine. They simply don't have enough weapons to carry out the same sort of extensive, meaningful damage on Russian infrastructure that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine's. Again, remember, 4,000 missiles a year, thousands and thousands of drones every single year. Ukraine does not have the ability to do this, even if they were allowed to strike anywhere within Russian territory. So again, this is another myth being spun to direct away from the fact that the strategic lay of this conflict favors Russia and continuously tilts in favor of Russia. The Business Insider article ends. This is how it ends. The Associated Press report that Ukraine's new strike abilities have greatly slowed Russia's momentum, with local reports saying Ukrainian troops have been able to push forward and reclaim some territory, though the country's military is still under great pressure. It's under great pressure because that's why Russia opened the new front in Kharkov. It wasn't to encircle and take the city of Kharkov. It was simply to add more pressure along the line of contact, to lengthen the line of contact. Russia has the arms, ammunition, and troops to place pressure along the entire line of contact. Ukraine does not have enough troops to protect the line of contact. As the article I opened this video with demonstrated, they are out of manpower. They are transferring Ukrainian soldiers from one desperate, futile fight along the line of contact to another. And when you're in that position, you're mobilizing your population who is running away, crossing the border to run away. You are trying to find prisoners to press into service. This is exactly why Russia is using a strategy of attrition to create these type of strategic dilemmas for Ukraine. They're not trying to break through defenses. They're not using maneuver warfare, big arrow offensives to seize huge tracts of territory. It's a war of attrition. The metrics that determine whether a strategy of attrition is working or not is not measured in territory. It's measured in the manpower, arms, ammunition, and infrastructure you're able to destroy, how much the enemy is able to reconstitute, and also your ability to constantly either grow or your diminishing military power. And as we can see, Russia is not only able to preserve manpower, equipment, and ammunition in greater quantities than Ukraine can, they're producing more, while Ukraine is losing more and unable to reconstitute losses in manpower, equipment, ammunition, arms. So this is where we are in the ongoing proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. Here in late June, early July, we can see the collective West faced with increasingly difficult decisions. Do we stand down in the Middle East instead of using Israel to continue expanding war there? Do we stand down there and transfer weapons either in the hands of the Israeli military or flowing to the Israeli military? Do we redirect that towards Ukraine to stretch that proxy war out longer? Do we continue in the Middle East at the expense of the conflict in Ukraine ending quicker and obviously in Russia's favor? These are all difficult decisions the US faces. It's not because they're just losing their proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. It's because they are losing geopolitically around the globe. The idea of them maintaining hegemony over a changing world and a growing multipolar world, the idea that they can maintain hegemony in this changing environment is irrational, and they cannot do it, and they will not do it. And it's just a matter of how this all unravels and where it begins unraveling first and where the US tries to hold on longer. So I will keep an eye on this conflict in Ukraine, as well as all the other conflicts the US is either waging or planning around the globe. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It helps the channel grow. It's free to do. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. On Telegram, I post absolutely all content there, including backups of all of my videos on YouTube. I also post links to articles that might actually even be censored on X, for example, in the video description, or all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's month to month or through one-time donations, or even if you have no additional resources and you're just helping share my work with others, all of that is greatly appreciated. All of that is what allows me to continue doing this work. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.